Welcome to your Macroeconomics test review. We went over this in class, but if you were gone or you want to review again, we're going to quickly run through the review sheet, which you can find available on our class Moodle page. So the first part, some definitions, some terms that you should be familiar with. The first one, they're full employment. Now, what we mean by that, obviously the economy is always going to have some people unemployed, and that those people that are always unemployed, we really call that frictional unemployment. So if we have somewhere between 3 and 5% unemployment in our country, we really consider that to be full employment. The different types of unemployment, we've got structural, cyclical, seasonal, and frictional. Those definitions are on one of your worksheets, but if you've forgotten what those are, frictional unemployment, that's that unemployment that kind of always exists. Frictionally unemployed are typically what we think of like people between jobs, moving to a new city, looking for a new job, or just out of college, haven't found your first job yet. The seasonal, I hope I don't have to spend a whole lot of time on. Look at the first part of the word, it's season. So if you're laid off in the winter because you work in construction and you can't do construction in the winter or something, you'd be seasonal. Cyclical, anytime you're talking about things involving the business cycle. So anytime you hear the word recession, you should think cyclical unemployment, or a downturn in the economy, you think cyclical unemployment. And then lastly, we have that structural unemployment. And what we mean by structurally unemployed, we really mean that skills don't match. In other words, skills don't match. There we go. In other words, there are jobs available, but if you're looking for it, maybe you need a different degree or a different educational background or some training or something before you're able to get that job. So if you're unemployed not because there aren't jobs available, but because you don't have the skills for them, we'd call you structurally unemployed. All of those people who we consider unemployed are looking for work. If you aren't looking for work, if you aren't actively searching for work, we don't consider you to be unemployed. We just don't count you as part of the labor force. Then still with the labor markets, we have this idea of derived demand. It's just the idea that if there's an increase in demand for products, then there's an increase in demand for labor, because the demand for labor, so labor demand comes from demand for goods. It's derived from demand for goods. Our Laffer curve, I actually want to find a little extra space to draw this one out, so I'm going to go to the bottom down here. This is that Laffer curve. He's the guy who created this, and the idea is pretty simple and yet pretty profound. And what he did is he graphed out and came up with this model of what tax revenue would look like, so how much the government would take in versus what the tax rate is. And if we have a 0% tax rate, government's going to get nothing. If we have a 100% tax rate, nobody's going to bother to work because the government's taking everything. So what we know is that as tax rates go up, government must start collecting some money, so this inevitably goes up. And at some point, what goes up must come back down if we're going to get back to zero down there. And so the curve may not be a perfect little parabola like I drew right there, but basically revenue will go up to a point while you're increasing taxes, but at some point, and I just call this my magical point, there's some magical point where tax revenue would be the highest, that you'd have the optimal tax rate, that the government would still be able to take in as much revenue as possible but not overtax people. And once you go beyond that point, people start not wanting to work. The tax rate's too high. So theoretically, and there are cases in our country and in other countries where you can see this actually happening, where if the tax rate was too high and you lowered it, you would actually increase the government revenue. And the idea is just, look, if tax rates aren't optimal, if they're too high, we might actually be able to increase government revenue by decreasing taxes. So that was the Laffer curve. Fiat money. Fiat money is this idea that our money, specifically U.S. dollars, has value because we say so. Money no longer is based on any sort of commodity. It's not commodity money, which is actual like silver coins, nor is it based on the gold standard anymore. Our money simply has value because we say so. We often call that a floating currency that doesn't have anything anchoring it. When we're talking about money, the two of the major measures, M1 and M2. M1 is cash, checking accounts, anything that's really easy to get your hands on. M2 is M1 plus things like savings accounts, things that are a little harder to get your hands on, the money that's a little harder to get a hold of. You might have to actually go to the bank to get that. You can't just write a check or use your debit card. CPI and PPI, those are both just price indexes. The consumer price index and the producer price index, they kind of track inflation and how much prices have changed over time for the same amount of goods. You take a look at that market basket of goods and see how much did it cost this year versus how much did it cost last year versus the year before, etc. And then lastly, GDP is that gross domestic product. I'm kind of out of space to write there, so gross domestic, and I'll write product over here. Gross domestic product is looking at the total amount of stuff that is produced inside of a country's borders. Not necessarily by companies that call themselves, say, U.S. companies, because then we'd be looking at like Coke's profits in Asia. No, we want to look at just what's produced inside our borders. And that's the what we use these days. You should know a few other things. You should be able to do that circular flow of the economy. That you had businesses and you had households, and how the money flowed to and from each other through the product market and resource market. The idea was, businesses give households money for their labor, for their time, for their resources. The most obvious one is their labor, so people get a paycheck. And then households use that money to buy products from businesses. So households give money to businesses to buy product. Included in there is the government. The government also goes through those product markets, buys stuff from businesses, and also gets resources from households. And this is looking kind of muddied here, but government works the same way, although we have to have the added direct transfers of taxes for services. So when government provides public parks to households, we don't specifically pay for them, so it's not like going through a product market. But we do get stuff, and when we give taxes to the government, we're not paying them specifically for something, so those are those direct payments back and forth. Same thing happens with businesses. So GDP, how do we calculate GDP? A couple things here. We really, I guess, essentially talked about three different ways. The main way, those main two ways that I'm talking about would be the consumption. Consumption. So that is that consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. Or we could take the income approach, add up how much people make. So those are really our two main ways. I will mention we did talk about that whole MV equals PQ, and although that wouldn't normally be a way to calculate GDP, P times Q is actually our nominal GDP. So that would be a third way you could talk about calculating GDP. You should be able to distinguish what is and what is not included in GDP. Remember, it's included our final goods and services. What's not included would be not final goods, so intermediate goods, goods, not gods, and also you wouldn't count things like used products or purely financial transactions. Used goods, financial, so if I'm buying stock, that's not counted because that's a financial transaction. Nothing was produced for it. So normally when I'm answering those, I think, was anything actually produced? And if something was produced, then yeah, it's probably counted. Obviously, something could be produced if you're producing it for yourself. If there's no market transaction, then we can't count it either, just because there's no market transaction. Being able to compare dollar amounts from one year to another, like if you want, if you've got a certain amount of money in, 2013, you should be able to convert it to $1979. And the way you do that was simply times the CPI of 1979 over the CPI of 2013. Those 2013s cancel, and you're left with dollar amount in 1979. So again, I'll give you those CPI numbers that you need, and you just have to convert it from one to the other, and then you can compare what was more money. You also need to be able to calculate the amount of inflation, and we're going to do that as a percentage. So you're going to do the CPI of we'll call it the, I miswrote there. You're going to do CPI of the new year minus CPI of the older year to find out how much it's changed, divided by CPI of that older year. Lastly, we already talked about this, but how CPI is calculated, and that's really looking at that market basket of goods. Federal Reserve System, who are they? They are the bank for the U.S. They're the central bank. There we go, central. So they're the bank for Congress, they're the bank for the banks, and their two main mandates, their two goals are low unemployment and low inflation. And the main thing they use then is what we call monetary policy, and that all revolves around that MV, money times velocity, equals price times quantity. So if you need to lower price, if you need to get inflation under control, you lower the money supply. If you need to increase Q, or increase GDP, because the economy is slipping into recession, you try to increase money supply. And the three tools to affect money supply are We'll call them the interest rates. That's the Fed funds rate. The Fed funds rate and the discount rate. That's the rate at which banks borrow. That's one of their tools. Their second tool is the reserve ratio. How much they require banks to keep on hand and not lend out. The more they require banks to hold, the less money there is to be borrowed, which means the money supply shrinks. High interest rates discourage buying. And then lastly are those open market transactions. That's where the U.S. or where the Fed transactions buys and sells government securities. When they buy something, they put money into the economy. When they sell something, they're taking money out of the economy. The money multiplier has to do with the reserve ratio. It's simply 1 over the reserve ratio. I probably should have written that a little bit better. Let me try rewriting that in a little neater fashion. 1 divided by the reserve ratio. So if $1,000 are deposited, and the reserve ratio is 10%, you do 1 divided by 0.1, or 10%, and you find out that money supply would grow by $10,000. The new money supply. Fiscal policy. The theory behind Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, was, hey, looking back at that C plus I plus G plus N, as if that's our GDP, we can increase or decrease government spending to increase or decrease the GDP in our economy. So Keynes really looked at government spending as a way to spur the economy. Supply side economics kind of came around in Reagan's era, and that idea was, hey, let's lower, or we could raise if we needed to, but lower taxes to get the economy going. And by lowering taxes, then people can consume more, they can invest more, and so thereby will increase our GDP. The biggest problem with both of these really amounts to what we call policy lag. It's hard to know what the effect is, it's hard to calculate the effect, and it often takes a long time for things to happen, and it's highly politicized, so it's really hard to gauge how effective fiscal policy really is. So it takes a long time for those two policies to get passed, to be approved, to take effect, and for us to be able to evaluate what happened. Really doesn't make fiscal policy as usable a tool for kind of controlling the economy as maybe we'd like it to be. Labor market, you should be able to use supply and demand curves, much like we did in product market. So if there's an increase in demand for cars, you're going to have an increase in demand for laborers, manufacturers, and so you're going to see an increase in the aggregate amount of wages and the amount of time people are working in those businesses. So you should be able to use those supply and demand curves to understand labor and labor laws. Lastly, you should know the uses and characteristics of money. So let me draw a little arrow so I can write those down over here. But the characteristics of money, first we need our money, in order for it to be useful, it needs to be acceptable. In other words, people need to acceptable. People need to accept it as a form of payment. 2, it needs to be portable. It's not very useful if you can't put it in your pocket and take it with you. It needs to be divisible. If we can't divide it, it's hard to do many transactions with it. Just think if we only had $100 bills, that would be pretty hard to use money. 4, so acceptable, portable, divisible. It also needs to be somewhat durable. These are the main 4. These are the 4 that your textbook talks about. Obviously, it's got to be durable. If it if it's something that is easily destroyed, we don't want to use it as money. Because one of the things that we use money for, one of the characteristics of money, is that we use it as a store of value. We use it to store. So if I go to work, I want to store the value of my labor, and I do that by getting a paycheck, by getting money. My handwriting was horrible there, but it's a store of value. So we need it to be durable so that it can actually last and store the value. I gave you two other characteristics, which are not in your book, but they are perhaps something you want to keep in the back of your mind. Money should be uniform. Uniform. In other words, it should all be the same. We should all be using the same thing. That's why countries issue their own national currency, because it works better, it's more acceptable if it's more uniform. And lastly, we do want it to be in limited supply. If it's unlimited supply, it doesn't do the things we need it to do. If we used rocks, for instance, as money, I would just go in my backyard and start digging until I found more rocks. And so it wouldn't be a useful means for us to use as money. So anyway, we use money as a store of value. We use it as a medium of exchange. We use it to exchange goods, and we also use it as a way to, we'll say, to compare value. It's hard to compare the value of a tablet computer to the value of a textbook. But we can compare it when we say, oh, well, this tablet cost $300, that textbook cost $125. The tablet's almost 3 times more valuable. So we use it as a way to compare value. So these are the 3 uses. And these are the 6 characteristics that we talked about of money. The last thing that you are going to want to have for this test is your timeline of United States banking. It talks about where the greenback, the dollars that we know today, came from, when the Federal Reserve System started. Your timeline should have really all of the significant events that are in that chapter that's available on Moodle, because you're allowed to have that timeline out during the test. You know, I might ask you a question like, when did the Federal Reserve System start? And so you'd want to have the date, but I'd probably ask you, I'd want more than just the date, 1913. It'd be in response to what? And you'd say, well, that was in response to the Panic of 1907. We established the Federal Reserve. So in other words, on your timeline, make sure you have enough information about the events, not just the dates of these events, in order to be able to thoroughly answer the questions that will be on your test. So that's all I've got for you. If you've got any more questions, by all means, give me a call, shoot me an email. I don't really care. Or shoot me a text if you want, 616-901-3205. Or you can email me at tstapert@grcs.org. I ran out of space, .org. So either email me or call me if you got any questions. Otherwise, good luck. I will see you on Tuesday. Thanks.